Alex Eala refused $1 billion. Not because the money was insufficient, because a single sentence buried inside that contract demanded she surrender something no figure on earth could replace. The lawyers stared at her. The executives exchanged glances. Nobody in that room, across decades of combined negotiating experience, had ever watched an athlete walk away from 10 digits over one clause. Picture what $1 billion means to a 20-year-old. Picture the freedom it purchases, the security it guarantees, the generational transformation it delivers, not just for one person, but for an entire family, an entire community, an entire nation that had been watching her every match from 7,000 islands scattered across the Pacific. Picture all of that sitting on a table in front of you. And then picture pushing it away, quietly, without drama, with the same composure she shows standing across the net from Iga Swiatek. That is exactly what Alex Eala did. And the reason she did it will tell you everything you need to understand about who she truly is, beneath the rankings, beneath the headlines, beneath every manufactured story that has attached itself to her name. Everything starts now. Before you can understand why she walked away from $1 billion, you need to understand what being Filipino means to Alex Eala. Not abstractly, not as a marketing position or a PR narrative, in the deepest, most personal, most non-negotiable sense possible. At 13, she departed the Philippines for Spain, relocating to train at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Manacor. She spent 6 formative years there, years that reshaped her game, her discipline, and her competitive psychology. And through all of it, she chose, consciously, deliberately, to maintain her connection to everything she had left behind. She described that effort with striking vulnerability. Sa tingin ko, malaking bagay yung lengguwahe sa kultura. To be completely transparent, I moved away at 13. Naturally, minsan, medyo pumapalpak na din yung Tagalog ko. And I made it a point, being very transparent, because being Filipino has brought me so many blessings, and that's why I'm so proud. She listened to OPM, original Filipino music. She tracked Filipino news. She absorbed TikTok humor in Tagalog, so she would never lose the specific cadence of her people's laughter. These were not public-facing gestures designed for endorsement campaigns. They were private acts of devotion, a young woman refusing to let geography dissolve identity. She articulated the weight of representation directly in a media event organized by her long-standing partner, Globe. It's such an honor. I just have to do my best to behave as well as I can because I know that, especially in the international tennis scene, I'm kind of what comes to mind when they think of Filipina. So I really do my best. I know that a lot of people look up to me. I just want to represent us in a way that Pinoys would be glad to be represented. After her historic U.S. Open first-round victory, the first Grand Slam singles win ever recorded by a Filipino, she told reporters, "I take so much pride in representing my country. It makes what I do bigger than myself, and it adds meaning to what I do." And in a 2026 interview with The Times, she reflected on the collective experience her performances had created. "It's wonderful, and I'm very grateful. I'm happy that Filipinos have the opportunity to know tennis. Ultimately, it's a way for us to come together and show pride in our culture. I have not seen that shared sense of pride in other places, and that makes us special." That phrase, "I have not seen that shared sense of pride in other places," is the foundation of everything this story requires you to understand, because a clause buried inside a $1 billion contract would attempt to dismantle precisely that, and she would not allow it. The commercial machinery surrounding Alex Eala had been accelerating through 2025 and into 2026 at a pace no management team fully anticipated. Industry observers had already confirmed that A-list companies were positioning themselves to secure her endorsement, drawing direct comparisons between her trajectory and Emma Raducanu's post-US Open commercial explosion. Both athletes possessing enormous fan bases across Japan, China, and the Philippines, alongside the kind of global reach that makes brand executives stop sleeping. China represented the most lucrative single territory. The mathematics were undeniable. A consumer market of 1.4 billion people, a sports economy expanding at extraordinary velocity, a tennis culture undergoing rapid development, hungry for relatable international ambassadors who could bridge aspiration and accessibility. And Alex Eala, ranked 29th in the world, the highest-ranked Filipino in WTA Tour history, a player who had dismantled Swiatek, Keys, Ostapenko, Paolini, and Gauff across consecutive seasons, represented exactly the commercial proposition that Chinese brand architects had been seeking. The offer materialized through established intermediaries. $1 billion, a multi-year agreement encompassing apparel, technology, lifestyle categories, and dedicated presence at Chinese sporting events. Numbers that by any conventional measure of athlete endorsement in the current market represented a ceiling nobody had expected a 20-year-old to approach. Her management reviewed it, her legal team examined every clause, and buried in the document, not prominently positioned, not flagged as significant by the presenting party, was a single sentence, a restriction so specific, so precisely targeted at the core of Alex Eala's identity that its inclusion could not have been accidental. The clause required that in all campaign materials, promotional content, public appearances, and associated communications produced under the agreement, she would represent herself exclusively as an Asian athlete, with no specific reference to the Philippines, Filipino identity, or Philippine National Association. Not a global athlete, not a tennis player. An Asian athlete. One sentence. Deliberately excising the specific country, strategically dissolving the precise national identity that had made her the phenomenon worth $1 billion in the first place. The lawyers explained that this was standard territory-specific language, that major markets frequently requested generalized regional identification to maximize domestic relatability, that the commercial logic was sound, the precedents were numerous, and the financial compensation was extraordinary. She listened, she asked one question, and then she delivered her answer. She did not raise her voice. That much every witness in the room agreed upon afterward. There was no theatrical rejection, no impassioned speech, no calculated performance designed for the story that would eventually emerge. She simply said, with the same composure she deploys standing at the baseline of a WTA 1000 stadium, no. And then she explained. At the 2022 U.S. Open, when she had claimed the junior singles title as a 17-year-old, she had delivered her acceptance remarks in Tagalog, in her native language, on an international stage where almost nobody in the immediate audience understood the words, but every Filipino watching understood every syllable. She had said, "Buong puso ko tong ipinaglaban. Hindi lang para sa sarili ko, kundi para makatulong din ako sa kinabukasan ng Pilipinas. So hindi lang to panalo ko, panalo natin tong lahat. This is not just my victory. This is all of ours." 3 years later, sitting across from lawyers and executives presenting a $1 billion contract, that declaration had not expired. It had compounded. She explained to the room that her value, the specific, irreplaceable, commercially extraordinary value that had attracted a $1 billion proposition in the first place, was inseparable from her identity as Filipino, that the crowds who followed her from tournament to tournament across 3 continents, staying awake through time zone-defying broadcasts, wearing handmade signs in Tagalog in stadiums from Miami to Wimbledon to Melbourne, were not following a generic Asian athlete. They were following a Filipina. The distinction was not cosmetic. It was structural. It was the entire architecture of her appeal. A Philstar analysis of the Eala phenomenon had captured precisely this truth. She activates diaspora identity. More than 10 million Filipinos live or work abroad. Sporting events become shared rituals that transcend geography. Cheering for Eala is not merely cheering for a player, it is asserting Filipino visibility in global arenas. She was not willing to erase that visibility for any number. A contract requiring her to denationalize herself, to exist commercially as a continental abstraction rather than a specific, proud, unambiguous Filipina, was not a contract she could sign, because the moment she signed it, she would no longer be the person the $1 billion was supposedly purchasing. The lawyers conferred. The executives stepped outside. When they returned, they suggested the clause was negotiable. She said it was not from her side. She would not endorse a document that required her to obscure her nationality in any territory, for any duration, for any compensation. She stood, she shook hands, she left. And in the corridor outside that conference room, something extraordinary began. Within 48 hours of the negotiations' collapse, the story had traveled. Not through official channels, her management maintained discretion, releasing no statement, but the commercial world is a landscape of porous boundaries, and the extraordinary nature of what had occurred was simply too significant to remain contained. An athlete had refused $1 billion over principle, specifically over national identity, over one sentence that asked her to be slightly less specific about where she came from. The reaction divided along sharp and revealing lines. Inside the traditional sports business community, agents, executives, consultants who had spent careers advising athletes to maximize financial return by minimizing political or cultural specificity, the verdict was immediate. She had made a catastrophic error. You do not refuse $1 billion over branding language. You negotiate. You seek compromise. You find a version of the clause that satisfies both parties. Walking away from 10 digits over one sentence was, in the language of conventional commercial logic, irrational. The misinformation ecosystem that had surrounded her name throughout 2025, fabricating stories about $45 million deals, AI-generated contracts, invented endorsements, had demonstrated one consistent truth. The Philippine public was hungry for evidence that Alex Eala was being compensated commensurate with her achievement and her cultural significance. The conventional expectation would have been that news of a rejected $1 billion deal would devastate that sentiment, that fans would be frustrated, that the refusal would feel like an athlete prioritizing personal principle over national economic impact. The opposite materialized. A Dubai-based OFW who had attended Eala's matches in person had previously articulated why her appeal transcended sport. I think Alex is so popular now because she represents more than just talent. She represents hope and pride for Filipinos. Seeing a young athlete compete and succeed on the international stage shows what we are capable of globally. When the Filipino community absorbed the specific details of her refusal, that she had surrendered $1 billion specifically to preserve the explicit, uncompromising declaration of Filipino identity, that sentiment did not diminish. It escalated into something almost impossible to measure commercially. She had not merely competed under the Philippine flag, she had chosen it over $1 billion. She had stood in a room of lawyers and executives offering her a number beyond imagination, and she had said, "I will not trade my country for this." She had once told Globe Media, "There's so much positive that I get from the Pinoys, so why would I focus on the negative? I'm very confident in myself, in my team, and in my work." That confidence, that unshakable foundation, was not a product of rankings or prize money. It was the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and had decided that identity was non-negotiable. The commercial world was now confronted with a fundamental question. What is authentic national identity worth in the marketplace? What price does genuine, uncompromising cultural devotion command? And does refusing to sell it actually increase or decrease its value? Here is what the conventional commercial calculation missed entirely. The billion-dollar offer was attractive specifically because Alex Eala's identity was specific. The clause demanding she generalize that identity was not a minor adjustment, it was a fundamental contradiction. The product they were purchasing and the conditions they were attaching were mutually exclusive. And every brand that understood that contradiction, every sponsor already associated with her, every commercial partner tracking her trajectory, recognized in the aftermath of her refusal that what she had demonstrated was not irrationality, it was integrity at a scale almost never witnessed in professional sport. Eala herself had articulated the operating philosophy beneath all of it. I'm very confident in myself, in my team, and in my work. Confidence rooted not in external validation, but in internal certainty. That certainty was now, commercially, more valuable than ever because it had been tested at the highest possible financial stakes and had held without hesitation. Industry analysts had already projected that her commercial ceiling was still rising, drawing comparisons to Raducanu's post-slam commercial explosion and identifying her as the most attractive option for sponsors looking to sign up the ultimate tennis influencer. Her refusal did not lower that ceiling, it raised it, because it demonstrated something every authenticity-obsessed global brand in 2026 will pay a premium for: an athlete whose identity cannot be purchased, modified, or strategically diluted. The Philstar analysis had framed this precise quality as the core of her cultural force. She represents discipline over drama. There is no spectacle, no controversy, just work, composure, and grit. In an age saturated with noise, quiet excellence feels refreshing. Quiet excellence. Refusing $1 billion without raising your voice. Walking away from 10 digits with handshakes and composure. That is not drama. That is something rarer and more durable than drama. That is character, demonstrated under conditions that would compromise almost anyone. Her message to young women across Asia, delivered at the U.S. Open: anything is possible, and dream big. She had not qualified that with a financial ceiling. She had not attached conditions. Anything. Dream big, without asterisks. The Chinese market would eventually present another opportunity, almost certainly a revised version, stripped of the compromising clause, because the commercial appetite for her presence in that territory was genuine and would not dissolve because of one failed negotiation. The $1 billion was not gone, it was deferred, and the terms under which it would eventually return would be hers. That is what principle purchased that money could not: leverage. The irreversible knowledge held by every future negotiating party that Alex Eala had been offered $1 billion and chosen her country instead. You cannot manufacture that. You cannot simulate it. You can only earn it once, permanently, and with everything at stake. History does not record every contract an athlete signs. It rarely records the ones they refuse. But occasionally, a rejection carries more weight than any acceptance because it reveals the exact contour of someone's character at the precise moment when everything was available for the right price. Alex Eala's refusal of one sentence in a $1 billion contract will be remembered longer than most of the deals she eventually signs. Not because the money was extraordinary, though it was. Not because the drama was manufactured, it was not. But because the reason she refused it was so simple, so clear, and so completely consistent with everything she had ever said, done, and demonstrated throughout her entire career that it required no explanation. She had told reporters at the U.S. Open, "To be Filipino is something I take so much pride in. I don't have a home tournament, so to be able to have this community here, I'm so grateful they made me feel like I'm home." Home. That is the word. For a 20-year-old who had spent 7 years training thousands of miles from her country, who had absorbed Spanish tennis culture without releasing Filipino identity, who had competed on courts in Miami and Eastbourne and Wimbledon and Guadalajara while wearing her nation's spirit as something more essential than any apparel contract, Home was not a location, it was a declaration. It was the Philippines. It was unconditional and it was forever. A Philstar columnist had articulated the deeper civic significance of her moment with precision. When we cheer Alex Eala, we cheer discipline, preparation, courage, and national pride. If we can unite in applause, we can unite in expectation. If we can celebrate excellence, we can demand good governance. The Alex Eala moment is not just about tennis, it is about remembering who we are when we stand together. She refused $1 billion, not for herself, not for leverage, not for publicity, for a declaration that had been true since she was 8 years old, signing her first endorsement with a Filipino telecommunications company, that she belonged to the Philippines, and the Philippines belonged to her, and no commercial clause, no matter its attached figure, would ever dissolve that bond. She had already reached a career-high world number 29. She had already become the first Filipino to break into the WTA top 30. She had defeated Swiatek, Keys, Paolini, Goff, and Ostapenko, the most decorated collection of opponents any young player had assembled across a single breakthrough stretch in recent WTA history. The career was ascending, the commercial opportunities were expanding, the global conversation around her name was accelerating, and underneath all of it, the rankings, the endorsements, the crowds, the viral moments, the fabricated stories, the verified achievements, there existed one foundation that had never moved and would never move. She was Filipino. Completely, without asterisks, without geographic adjustments for the right market, and she had just proved it with $1 billion on the table. The question no one in that room and no one analyzing the story from the outside has yet answered with certainty is, when the next offer arrives, bigger, more carefully worded, stripped of the compromising clause, will she carry into that negotiation the same quiet, devastating confidence? Or did refusing the $1 billion teach her something about her own value that changes every conversation that follows? Drop your perspective in the comments, because the story of Alex Eala is the most compelling negotiation between money and meaning in modern sport, and we are documenting every chapter of it as it unfolds. Subscribe right now, because the next move in this story belongs entirely to her, and you will not want to discover it secondhand.